Hello everyone, my name is Toby. I'm from the International Association for Political Science Students, and right now we are again live from the World Congress of IAPSS, the International Political Science Association here in Australia, in Brisbane. And I'm very happy right now that I'm here with Maria Esperanza Casullo from the Universidad Nacional de Rio Negro, and we are talking about the populist body in the age of social media. Welcome.
Thanks for the invitation.
I want to start because we again discuss a topic that is very close to the issue of populism and of populist representation. There is a huge Eurocentrism in large parts of the discipline you study, especially Latin American countries. If you look at what your European colleagues or your US colleagues study, what do you think one has to consider when especially looking at Latin American countries? What is different in this regard?
Well, I think that especially in the topic that I study, which is populism, now there is this sense that you have this wave of populism sort of crashing over the world, and that populism is a really new topic and new phenomenon. And people that live and study other parts of the world, I guess we can say that populism is actually a pretty old phenomenon, and we've been writing and studying it for the 20th century at least. So not only Latin America, but also in parts of Asia, Africa. So, and it's a little bit frustrating because sometimes some of the conversations around populism only read what's now being written on European and American populism, and there's tons and tons of other productions that can be read from people from Latin America, from India, from Turkey, that have a lot of insight to offer.
What kind of insights are these, especially when we look at the countries you're studying mainly?
Well, one of the insights is that a lot of the political science today treats populism as if it's specifically a right-wing phenomenon. And actually what I think you can see is that populism is a certain strategy, a certain form of doing politics, a certain form of accumulating power, but that can be used to advance wildly different ideologies or public policy preferences. So you can have a populist president who is very right-wing, but you can also have a populist president who is a left-wing, or you can have a populist party that is a very right-wing, and you can have a populist party that is very left-wing. And I think those things need to be analytically distinguished in order for the analysis to function. And a lot of the time now in some of the conversations, because most of the populist parties in Europe are right-wing, it's really very common to think that populism is only right-wing. But that's not necessarily true. And there are also parties that are right-wing and are not populists. There have been a number of them, even in Europe. So maybe the problem is not so much or not only populism, but right-wing ideology per se. So I think it's important to keep the two separated. The other thing is that in Latin America we can see that you can have populist leaders and parties that are sort of compatible with democracy. The Peronist party in Argentina has existed for over 70 years, and Argentine democracy is sort of chugging along. So I think that then the question for me is not how to completely eradicate populism, which you're not going to be able to, but how to come up with some sort of accommodation between these populist tendencies that come from the sovereignty of the people and the institutions of liberal democracy that are democratic, or at least they are not anti-democratic.
I think one very interesting observation is that people who vote for populist parties, for example, in the United States, are not coming from one class or one part of the society. So actually the typical assumptions do not work anymore, that it's only a movement that comes from one part of the society. How does this look in Latin America? Who votes for populist parties?
Well, but that's the thing with populism. Populism rearranges the cleavages of political representation, and all the populist movements, in a way, they become successful when they are able to create new coalitions, and that's what populism does. It's able to bring together people to create an identity in which people from different social groups, different cultural groups, different geographical locations come together in ways that were unthinkable before. And the political arena gets rearranged. Now, if this is true, then when you have a successful populist experience, movement, party, or leader, and if the political field gets rearranged, and you have new combinations, like in the Bolivian case with the MAS and Evo Morales, you have a movement that brings together people from the union sectors from the cities with indigenous peasants from the countryside, with teachers, with small entrepreneurs for the cities. Now, if that is the case, then once populism sort of rearranges the political spectrum, you need, in order to oppose that, let's assume that you don't like that party or that president, you also need to come up with a new identity. It's not enough to just uphold the previous identities, because the previous identities have been rearranged. And you can see this in the European case so clearly, in which many of the successful populist parties, now their voters used to vote for left-wing social democratic parties or socialist parties 20 or 30 years ago. And now they are voting for this much more xenophobic populist parties. So in order to understand that, then you need a new identity as well. It's not going to be enough to just uphold the old identities. And I think Professor Pipa Norris was very clear when she said in the President's plenary, now the cleavages is no longer left-right in a way. It's this sort of right-wing populism and a new identity which probably needs to be created.
Mm-hmm. Again, coming back to this point, there must be some regional factors, however, that have kind of an impact of where the populism develops. Which kind of indicators are creating this?
Well, there are a number of regional factors. There are institutional factors, there are cultural factors. For example, in the European case, the fact that all the European countries have parliamentary systems create completely different dynamics than in the Latin American and North American cases, which all have presidential systems. Mm-hmm. So in one case, the figure of the president, of the leader, is much more central than the other, in which parties dare to be more strong. Then there's clearly a very different phenomenon, very different element that has to do with the legacies of colonialism, and the much greater role that xenophobia and white supremacism have in the European and North American context. It's very clear to see this distinction where, when contemporary right-wing populist parties talk about the people in Europe, they have a much more nostalgic vision of the people as something that was glorious and good and pure and authentic, constituted in the past, and that people need to be protected from contamination. In Latin American cases, when populist leaders talk about the people, you don't have this nostalgic sense because there's no golden era to come back to. So when they talk about the people tends to be more modernistic. There's a sort of, we need to construct this. And then you have all this sort of, I don't know, mixtures of socialism with modernism, with avant-garde thinking that gives you different combinations. And I think the other difference is that you see that in the at the ending of the 90s, you have the crisis of neoliberalism in Latin America, and out of those crises, you see left-wing populist governments appearing. In Europe, after 2008, the interesting question for me is that you have similar crises of the financial sector and structural adjustment, but then you have a much more movement towards right-wing forms of populism. And I don't have an adequate explanation as to why is that.
Yeah. We have one question that just came in by Lee, who asks, how much are populist movements affected or limited by institutional structures that are reinforced by incumbent governments once populist movements are incorporated into the system?
Well, you have a whole variety of possible outcomes. You can have Paris Aslanidis, who's a colleague at Yale University, presented a very interesting paper about this and how populist movements can be or cannot be successful politically. Some of them decide to run in elections and they win. Some of them get absorbed into mainstream political parties. Some of them just disappear, like Occupy Wall Street. They go through a peak of activism, but it's not clear that they have a political impact. I think there's many variables that have to do with the political structure of opportunity, with how grave the lack of trust in institutions is. The more that the people feel that the institutions have failed them, the more willing they are going to be to entertain the idea of going in another direction identity-wise. So it's not clear to me that you can generalize. It has to do with what the strategies of the other parties are, whether the mainstream parties are open to incorporating these new movements or resist these new movements. So you can have a whole variety of outcomes.
One thing, and therefore also shifting then more into your current research, is actually social media, and social media is one part of the civil society, and therefore also a kind of part of this social system that we're talking about when we speak about the robustness. What implications did the rise of social media in the society have on these different indicators that we were talking about?
Well, I would say that specifically from the point of view of studying populist leadership, which is a specific thing, not populist movements or parties, but the rise of charismatic leaders, you can see that the charismatic leader establishes a very strong representative bond with his or her followers. And it's very clear that there are some critical junctures in history where new technologies appear and they help create this idea that the leader is communicating directly with the people. And you can see this with the appearance of the mass press at the late 19th century. You can use it when radio appeared, and then FDR was able to use the radio very effectively. You can see this with the first when television arrived. New technologies, because they are sort of out there and they are not institutionalized and they don't have the whole set of gatekeepers and mediation structures, create this experience of closeness between the people and the leader. And one of the things, or the things that I'm interested now is social media is also, so they create this. A lot of politicians say, why why do I need to give interviews to the established press when I have 5 million Twitter followers and I can talk to them directly? And I'm interested in how that's used to convey certain bodily image of the leader that people feel represents them in the way they talk, in the way they dress, in the way they... And this is very, very... It has a very profound impact, even beyond or beneath or before ideology or political discourses.
How exactly in your studies you're talking about the populist body? Which role does this concept play within these ideas?
Well, the body becomes a signifier. The body becomes a sort of symbolic tapestry that personifies the people. So personifies the people and at the same time performs charismatic exceptionality and distance from the same people. So the populist leaders resemble the people in some key aspects that they choose. So there's a work here of choosing which symbols you're going to embody, and there's also a sort of showing that the leader is exceptional. So you have, for example, Evo Morales, who's an indigenous person, and so he has this very sort of elaborate, very simple in a way, but also very elaborate, or in the sense of thought about a strategic bodily performance that mixtures elements from the indigenous aesthetics in his clothes, in wearing garlands of coca leaves, but also has this performance of power in his very well cut fine suits. That kind of, I'm interested in. Or Donald Trump. Donald Trump is very good in performing the high and the low at the same time, right? He does this displays of wealth, but at the same time, he eats McDonald's or KFC. So he's telling to the people, look, you need to admire me because I'm so successful and I've achieved all this in my life, but at the same time I'm rejecting sort of good behavior, and I'm behaving like if I were a simple poor person like you. And I think a lot of people find that combination of the high and the low very attractive.
I think one factor in Europe and in European populism when it comes also to media and social media is that, as you've mentioned before, there's kind of this discourse about a global populist movement, basically. And how is this global populist movement taking place in Latin America? Because you also have very distinct, very different particular leaders. These leaders do have very different goals. Do they, as in Europe now, collaborate in a certain way? Are they working against each other? Is there some common ground? How can we understand this?
I'm not sure whether you can say that there's a coordinated global populist movement. What you can see, and yesterday I was also listening to a fascinating paper on precisely this transnational populist activism, and the colleagues show all these great images of Australian far-right groups marching and mobilizing and doing, for example, mobilizing with banners of the Greek far right-wing party Golden Dawn, or mobilizing with a Trump banner. So what you can certainly see is a sort of imitation effect, solidarities effect, in which people say, hey, I like what these other guys are doing. Let's do the same thing. And at the same time, when you probably have a better chance of being portrayed in the media if you march with a banner that says "Go Trump" than if you don't do that, because the media is more attuned to that now. So you definitely see this kind of diffusion, and of course, you do see, and the researchers also show this. You see a lot of interaction in social media from people around the globe, in Facebook, in Twitter, people that collaborate in some sort of far right wing, and also in some cases left wing. But I think that it's different. But I think that even in that case, populism has this one thing that it's always very local in the way that it has to do with rising against the elites. So you have to know which elites exist in every particular place. It's not the same. And I think it's also a difference here between right-wing populism and left-wing populism, that you see more of a common theme in right-wing populism in white supremacy that you see in left-wing populism.
Thank you. I would like to conclude and to close into our interview with a question relating to the core of your research, basically. Then also the future of social media's impact on populism, or vice versa as well. How do you see this development evolve in the future? How social media can affect political discourses and the development of populism?
Well, I think that we're going to see, or we're going to have to see with social media, the same kind of things that we saw with all the other media, which is a process of political deliberation and, quite frankly, regulation of some of the social media. And of course, this doesn't mean censorship or thought police or whatever, but I think it's important to understand that every single new media, so first you have a new media, then that media sort of explodes and changes the media landscape, and then people start thinking, we love this new media, but maybe there are these things which we don't want, so we need to regulate this. And this happened with the press. There's a whole body of legal literature on freedom of the press, and newspapers had to put responsible editors and libel laws. The same thing happened with radio, the same thing happened with television. With televisions, you have laws that, regulate what kind of contents can be shown during the day, so that the children are watching. You have regulations as to how many advertisements you can show. And I think that we more and more we're going to see this in regards to social media, which is a wonderful and very effective tool that I use probably too much, but it's also something that has impacts on political life, and therefore we need to discuss how we're going to treat that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. It was really nice to talk to you, and also thank you for raising your questions. I want to wish you a great stay in Brisbane, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Okay, thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.